Welcome. Tonight, as we drift to sleep, we will be walking through the history of Los Angeles. Before there were streets or names or borders drawn across maps, there was only land. A wide basin resting between mountains and ocean, shaped slowly over time by forces that did not hurry. Dry hills holding the light of the sun for most of the year, and then, at certain times, a soft marine layer rolling in from the Pacific, cooling everything it touches, as if the land itself is briefly exhaling. This is the place that would one day be called Los Angeles. But at this point in time, it is not a city. It is not even an idea of a city. It is simply a landscape that exists on its own terms, long before human planning begins to organize it into something recognizable. To the west, the ocean stretches outward in a calm and steady way, its surface changing color with the sky. To the north and east, mountains rise in quiet barriers, not harsh in their presence, but constant, like distant walls that shape how air and water move through the region. And between these edges, the basin opens wide, a space where life gathers in its own patterns. Small rivers and seasonal streams cut through the land, sometimes strong after rain, sometimes reduced to dry channels of sand and stone. In some places, the earth is fertile and green for part of the year, especially after winter rains. In other places, it remains dry and pale, holding only the memory of water that passed through long ago. The seasons here are not dramatic in the way they might be in colder or wetter climates. Instead, they move in subtle shifts. A change in light, a change in wind, the slow arrival of warmth or coolness carried on air from far away. Time, in this place, feels less like a series of sharp divisions and more like a continuous flow. Before cities, before roads, before even the earliest written records of settlement, there are people who live here in close relationship with this land. They understand its cycles in ways that are learned through observation and memory, passed down through generations. The ocean provides food and connection. The hills provide shelter and plants that can be gathered. The valleys offer space to move and trade and live. But even without focusing on specific names or events, what matters most is the sense of balance that exists here for a long stretch of time. The land is not waiting to become something else. It is already complete in its own way, shaped by natural rhythms that do not require outside direction. And yet, like many places on Earth, this region will eventually become part of larger movements of people, empires, and ideas. Not all at once, and not in a single moment, but gradually, through contact and change that arrives over time. The quiet landscape will begin to carry new meanings layered on top of older ones. From a distance, this transformation might seem sudden, but from the perspective of the land itself, it is slow, almost imperceptible at first. A path becomes a trail becomes a road, a gathering place becomes a settlement, and much later, much farther along in time, a settlement becomes something far larger than it ever intended to be. But none of that has happened yet. For now, there is only the basin, only the light shifting across the hills, only the ocean breathing in and out along the coast, and the long, quiet sense that this place is waiting, not for anything specific, but simply for time to continue moving forward. As we begin this history, we are not starting with a city. We are starting with silence, and with land that has been here far longer than any name it will ever be given. Long before there is a city called Los Angeles, and long before there is even a settlement that carries a permanent name, the coastline of Alta California remains largely unknown to the outside world. From the perspective of the land itself, nothing changes quickly. The ocean continues its slow rhythm against the shore. The basin remains wide and quiet. The mountains still stand at a distance, shaping the movement of air and water without being disturbed by human plans. But far beyond this coastline, across an entire ocean, the world is expanding. In the 1500s, Spanish ships begin to explore the Pacific in long, uncertain voyages. These journeys are not aimed specifically at the land that will one day become Los Angeles. Instead, they are part of a much larger pattern of exploration, trade, and empire building that stretches across continents and centuries. Ships travel north along the coast of what is now Mexico and California, guided by wind and current, often passing by the future site of Los Angeles without stopping. The coastline is long, uneven, and unfamiliar. In many cases, it is simply recorded and then left behind, as the priority of these voyages is movement rather than settlement. From the land's perspective, these early encounters are brief. A sail on the horizon, a ship passing through fog, a moment of observation from a distance, and then silence again. For a long time, there is no permanent European presence in this region. The coastline remains what it has always been, home to indigenous communities who live within the rhythms of the basin and the nearby valleys, moving through familiar seasonal cycles, fishing along the shore, and maintaining trade routes that connect villages across a wide region of Southern California. But gradually, the Spanish crown begins to turn more attention toward Alta California. By the late 1700s, the idea of settlement becomes more concrete. Not just passing ships, but permanent presence. Missions, presidios, and pueblos begin to form part of a broader strategy to secure the northern frontier of New Spain. The land that once existed outside of formal colonial structure is now being mapped into it. Even so, this process unfolds slowly. Expeditions move overland from what is now Mexico, traveling through difficult terrain. Rivers, deserts, and mountain passes must all be crossed. These journeys take weeks or months, and every new region encountered is described in reports that will later influence where settlements might be placed. In these accounts, the Los Angeles basin is noted as a place with water, fertile soil in certain areas, and a climate that appears favorable for agriculture. It is not described as a major center, but as a promising location within a much larger landscape that is still being understood. At this point, the land begins to shift in meaning. It is still the same physical place, shaped by the same winds and seasons. But in the minds of distant planners and explorers, it is slowly becoming something else. A point on a map, a potential settlement site, a place that might serve a larger system of missions and supply routes. In 1769, the Portola expedition travels through California, marking one of the first recorded overland journeys by Europeans through the region. Members of the expedition pass through the Los Angeles basin without establishing a settlement, but their presence is significant in another way. It confirms that the region is reachable, navigable, and suitable for future development under Spanish colonial expansion. A few years later, more structured plans begin to take shape. The Spanish mission system is expanding northward. Its purpose is both religious and strategic, to convert indigenous populations to Christianity and to establish stable settlements that reinforce colonial control over the region. As missionaries and soldiers move into Southern California, they begin to lay the groundwork for permanent towns and missions. The Los Angeles basin becomes one of the chosen locations for this expansion. Still, nothing happens all at once. There is no sudden transformation. No single moment where the land changes identity overnight. Instead, there is a gradual layering of intention over geography. A site is chosen. A route is traced. A small group is sent to establish a settlement. And slowly, almost quietly, the future city begins to take shape in its earliest form. The people who already live in the region continue their lives as they have for generations, though now they begin to encounter new arrivals more frequently. These encounters are complex, shaped by communication, misunderstanding, cooperation, and conflict. The world is no longer isolated, but becoming shared, unevenly and unpredictably. From a distance, it might seem like the beginning of something dramatic. but in reality, it is still a quiet process. Wood is gathered, adobe is shaped, paths are worn into the ground. New structures appear slowly against the backdrop of the basin, and the name of the place, still not yet fixed in its final form, begins to move toward permanence. El Pueblo de Los Angeles has not been founded yet, but the conditions for its founding are already in motion, and as history continues forward, the landscape that once existed in relative stillness is now gently entering a new phase, one defined not by silence alone, but by the first faint presence of outside connection, arriving like distant footsteps along the edge of the coast. Not yet a city, not yet a story fully told, but no longer entirely untouched. By the time we reach the year 1781, the land that would one day become Los Angeles has already been shaped by centuries of quiet continuity, and only a few decades of distant awareness from outside empires. And now, for the first time, something more permanent begins to take form. It does not arrive suddenly. There is no single moment where a city appears. Instead, there is a decision made far away, carried slowly across distance, and then translated into action by a small group of people moving through a vast landscape. The Spanish colonial government, expanding its presence in Alta California, has a simple but far-reaching intention: to establish a network of settlements that can support agriculture, religion, and control over the northern frontier of New Spain. Within this plan, the Los Angeles Basin is chosen as a suitable site. It has access to fresh water from the river. It has fertile soil in certain areas. It has open land that can support farming and grazing. And perhaps most importantly, it sits at a distance from other settlements, offering space for a new pueblo to take shape. And so, in late September of 1781, a small group of settlers sets out. They are not a large force. They are not a wave of migration. They are a carefully organized group, composed of families, soldiers, and administrators, guided by colonial authorities and accompanied by the hope that this new settlement will take root. They travel slowly, carrying what they need to begin life in a new place: tools, livestock, seeds, basic supplies, everything required not for comfort, but for survival and establishment. When they arrive in the basin, they find a landscape that is already familiar in its patterns, though new in its meaning to them. The river flows seasonally. The soil varies in richness depending on proximity to water. The surrounding hills frame the valley in a wide, quiet arc. And here, near the banks of the Los Angeles River, they begin to build. The settlement they establish is given a long and formal name: El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de Los Angeles de Porciúncula, a name that reflects both religious devotion and colonial tradition, though in everyday use it will gradually shorten over time into simpler forms. At first, the pueblo is small. A handful of adobe structures rise from the earth, homes made of sun-dried clay, shaped slowly by hand. Storage buildings, a modest plaza at the center, fields laid out nearby for crops, and paths forming naturally between them as people move back and forth in their daily routines. Life begins in a very immediate way. There is no infrastructure beyond what is built by hand, no established roads beyond trails, no systems of trade beyond what is carried in or grown locally. Everything depends on cooperation, labor, and the unpredictable cycles of weather and water. The river, in particular, becomes central to survival. At certain times of year, it flows steadily, providing water for crops and livestock. At other times, it becomes shallow or changes course slightly, reminding the settlers that this is not a controlled environment, but a living landscape with its own rhythms. Agriculture begins slowly. Wheat is planted. Fruit trees are introduced. Livestock is raised in open grazing areas. And over time, the settlement becomes more self-sustaining, though never entirely stable in the way that later cities will be. The Pueblo is also not isolated from the wider region. It exists within a network of missions and settlements across Alta California. Trade and communication move along these routes, connecting Los Angeles to places both north and south, though always with difficulty and distance involved. And alongside the Spanish settlers, the indigenous people of the region remain present. Their lives do not begin with the founding of the Pueblo. They continue from what came before it. Some interactions involve cooperation and exchange. Others involve displacement and tension. The relationship between groups is complex, shaped by language, labor, survival, and the unequal structures of colonial expansion. From a historical distance, this period can be described in simple terms as a founding. But in lived experience, it is something more layered. It is the introduction of new structures into an existing world. It is adaptation on all sides, though not always by choice. It is the beginning of a place that is still uncertain in its future. Over time, the Pueblo grows, but slowly. There is no rapid expansion yet. No skyline. No dense urban core. Just a gradually strengthening settlement that remains closely tied to agriculture and the land around it. The plaza becomes a center of activity. People gather there for trade, announcements, and community life. Roads begin to extend outward in informal patterns, connecting fields and homes. The rhythm of daily life becomes more established, though still fragile in the face of droughts, floods, and the limitations of early infrastructure. And through it all, the surrounding landscape remains dominant. The mountains still define the horizon. The ocean remains nearby, though not yet central to the Pueblo's economy. The basin continues to stretch outward in all directions, far larger than the settlement itself, holding space for what it might one day become. At this stage, Los Angeles is not a city in any modern sense. It is a small agricultural pueblo, shaped by necessity, sustained by effort, and still deeply dependent on the land. But something important has changed. There is now a permanent human presence here. A fixed point in the landscape where daily life continues, where generations will eventually pass through, and where the slow transformation of the basin into a major urban region has quietly begun. And as the years move forward from this moment, the Pueblo will not remain small forever. But for now, it is enough to exist, quietly, near the river, in a wide basin that is still much larger than anything built upon it. In the early years of the Pueblo, life in Los Angeles moves in a rhythm that is slow, repetitive, and closely tied to the land. There is no sense yet of a growing city, no feeling of expansion or skyline or industrial change. Instead, there is simply a small settlement sitting within a vast basin, surrounded by open land that stretches far beyond what is immediately needed. The people who live here wake with the light, and their days are shaped not by clocks or schedules, but by tasks that depend on weather, water, and season. Morning begins quietly. The sun rises over the eastern hills, gradually illuminating adobe homes clustered near the plaza. Smoke may rise from cooking fires. Animals are tended. Water is gathered. And as the day begins to form, so too does the structure of daily life. The Los Angeles River is central to everything. It is not a constant river in the modern sense, but a seasonal system, sometimes flowing strongly after rain, and at other times shrinking into shallow channels or hidden groundwater beneath the sand. Because of this, water management becomes one of the most important parts of survival. Small irrigation channels are created to bring water toward fields. Crops depend on careful timing and attention. Too much water or too little can both shape the outcome of a season. In this way, life here is always in conversation with the environment. Agriculture forms the foundation of the pueblo's existence. Wheat is grown in small fields. Corn and beans are cultivated where conditions allow. Fruit trees are introduced and slowly take root in the soil. Livestock, especially cattle, move across nearby grazing land, watched over by vaqueros who travel on horseback across open terrain. These riders become an important part of the landscape. They move between fields and ranch land, managing herds and maintaining the agricultural system that supports the settlement. Over time, their presence becomes one of the defining features of early Southern California life, though at this stage, everything is still relatively small in scale. The pueblo itself remains modest. At its center is the plaza, a simple open space that functions as the heart of community life. Around it are adobe buildings made from earth, water, straw, and sunlight. These structures are not built for permanence in the modern architectural sense, but they endure because they are maintained, repaired, and reshaped as needed. There are no tall buildings, no dense streets, no separation between city and countryside. Instead, the pueblo blends into its surroundings. Fields begin where homes end. Dirt paths extend outward without strict boundaries. The line between settlement and landscape is soft, and always shifting. Social life is equally interconnected. Families gather in the plaza. Work is often shared or coordinated. Trade happens in informal ways, shaped by trust and necessity. News travels slowly, carried by people moving between settlements, missions, and ranchos across the region. Religion also plays a role in daily structure. As part of the Spanish colonial system, Catholic traditions are present in the life of the pueblo. The mission nearby influences spiritual and community practices, shaping festivals, rituals, and the calendar of important dates. These rhythms add another layer to time, one that exists alongside agricultural cycles and seasonal changes. But even with these structures in place, life remains deeply practical. Every day involves work tied directly to survival, repairing homes, tending animals, growing food, fetching water, maintaining tools. There is little separation between labor and living, and almost everything requires physical effort and cooperation. The environment itself remains a constant presence. Hot, dry summers stretch across the basin. Winters bring cooler air and occasional rain. Wind moves through the valley in predictable patterns, and the distant mountains are always visible, marking the edges of the world as it is known at the time. At night, the settlement becomes quieter. Without artificial light, the sky opens fully. Stars are visible in a way that feels expansive and uninterrupted. The darkness is not empty, but full of subtle presence. Firelight becomes the center of each home, and conversation slows as the day comes to an end. In these moments, the pueblo feels especially small. A few clustered buildings near a river, surrounded by vast land that has not yet been divided into streets, districts, or infrastructure. A place still close to its original form, where human presence is present but not dominant. And yet, even in its simplicity, something is beginning to develop. Patterns of trade are forming. Routes are becoming more established. Relationships between settlements are growing more structured. The land is slowly being drawn into a wider network that connects it to distant regions of California and beyond. But none of this is rapid. It is gradual, almost imperceptible from within a single lifetime. Day follows day. Season follows season. And the pueblo continues, quietly, without interruption, as if it has always existed in this form and will continue to do so indefinitely. But history rarely remains still. Even here, in this quiet early period, change is slowly gathering at the edges. not yet visible in dramatic ways, but present in the background, like distant movement beyond the hills. And as time continues forward, the small pueblo will begin to feel those changes more clearly. For now, though, life remains steady, simple, grounded in land, water, and sky, and shaped by a world that is still, for the moment, mostly quiet. As the 19th century begins, life in the Pueblo of Los Angeles continues much as it has for years. The settlement remains small. The plaza remains the center of daily activity. The river still provides water, though never quite as predictably as its residents would prefer. Farmers tend their fields, livestock graze across open land, and travelers arrive only occasionally from distant settlements. From the perspective of the people living in Los Angeles, the world can often feel very far away. And yet, events unfolding thousands of miles from the basin are about to reshape the future of California. In 1821, after more than a decade of conflict, Mexico gains its independence from Spain. For the residents of Los Angeles, this political change does not arrive with dramatic fanfare. There are no enormous celebrations in the Pueblo, no immediate transformation of daily routines. The sun still rises over the hills. Crops still need tending. Cattle still need watching. But the government that oversees California has changed. The Spanish Empire, which had established the Pueblo 40 years earlier, no longer controls the region. California is now part of the newly independent nation of Mexico. At first, many aspects of life remain familiar. The adobe homes still line the plaza. Religious traditions continue. But over time, new policies begin to alter the structure of land ownership and society throughout California. One of the most important changes involves land itself. During the Spanish period, missions held enormous influence across California. Large areas of land were controlled through mission systems that combined agriculture, religion, and colonial administration. Under Mexican rule, this arrangement begins to shift. The government gradually moves toward secularization, reducing mission control over vast stretches of land. As mission lands are redistributed, large private land grants begin to emerge. These grants become known as ranchos. The rancho era is, in many ways, the age of open space. Huge tracts of land are granted to families and individuals. Some ranchos cover tens of thousands of acres. Boundaries often follow natural features rather than precise surveys. Hills, valleys, rivers, and grazing areas define ownership more than fences do. The Los Angeles basin, still lightly populated, suddenly feels even larger. Across the countryside, cattle ranching expands dramatically. Cattle become the foundation of the regional economy. Vaqueros ride for miles without encountering significant development. Trails connect ranchos to one another, creating a landscape that feels vast and loosely connected. At this time, cattle are valued less for their meat than for their hides and tallow. Animal hides are sometimes called California banknotes because they serve as one of the region's most important trade goods. Ships arrive along the coast to collect them, carrying products that connect California to distant markets around the world. This trade remains relatively slow by modern standards. Weeks or months may pass between arrivals. News travels gradually. Goods move at the pace of horses, wagons, and sailing vessels. Los Angeles is becoming more connected. The Pueblo itself grows modestly during this period. Its population remains small, but activity increases. More trade passes through the settlement. More ranchos surround the basin. More people move between communities throughout Southern California. The plaza continues to serve as the heart of civic life. Markets take place there. Celebrations and festivals bring residents together beneath the warm California sun. The pace remains relaxed compared to larger cities elsewhere in the world, but the settlement is slowly becoming more established. Meanwhile, daily life on the ranchos develops its own distinctive rhythm. Imagine a morning on a Southern California rancho in the 1830s. The air is cool before sunrise. Horses wait near corrals. Cattle graze across hills that seem to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. Vaqueros prepare for long rides, carrying ropes and tools that have become essential parts of their work. Days are spent managing herds, repairing structures, maintaining water supplies, and traveling across large distances. The work is demanding, but it is also shaped by the openness of the landscape. Unlike crowded cities in Europe or the eastern United States, much of Southern California remains remarkably spacious. For many residents, the land itself becomes the defining feature of life. The mountains remain constant landmarks. The river continues its unpredictable course. The ocean, though not always visible, exerts its influence through weather and trade. Yet beneath this calm surface, important changes are taking place. The indigenous peoples of the region continue to experience profound disruption as colonial systems evolve under Mexican rule. Communities adapt in different ways, but the effects of earlier mission policies and expanding settlement remain significant. At the same time, California's population becomes increasingly diverse. People of Spanish, indigenous, African, and mixed ancestry contribute to the social fabric of the region. The settlement that will eventually become one of the world's largest cities is already developing as a place where different cultures, histories, and experiences intersect. Still, Los Angeles remains far from becoming a major urban center. It is, at its core, a frontier community. Its buildings are low. Its roads are dusty. Its economy depends heavily on agriculture and ranching, and its future remains uncertain. Few residents could imagine the metropolis that will someday rise here. If they could somehow see the future, they would struggle to recognize it. The endless grazing lands would become neighborhoods. The trails would become highways. The open countryside would fill with homes, businesses, and millions of people. But that future is still distant. For now, the rancho era continues. The cattle move slowly across the hills. The pueblo gathers around its plaza, and life unfolds according to the rhythms of land, weather, and seasons. Yet beyond California, larger forces are already beginning to gather. New migrants are arriving in the American West. Trade routes are expanding. Political tensions are growing between nations. And before long, Los Angeles will find itself entering another chapter of change. A chapter that will bring California into the United States and set the stage for a transformation far greater than anyone in the quiet pueblo can yet imagine. As the 1840s unfold, Los Angeles remains a quiet pueblo surrounded by ranchos, grazing lands, and open countryside. The settlement is still small enough that most residents know one another. Horses move along dusty trails connecting ranches and settlements. The plaza remains the social and commercial heart of the community. From the perspective of daily life, change feels slow. But beyond California, larger forces are beginning to gather. The United States is expanding westward. Thousands of settlers are moving across the continent. New territories are being claimed, mapped, and incorporated into a rapidly growing nation. And California, though distant from Washington, D.C., is becoming increasingly important. In 1846, tensions between the United States and Mexico erupt into the Mexican-American War. For residents of Los Angeles, this conflict is not a distant event reported in newspapers weeks later. It arrives directly in California, bringing uncertainty to communities that have spent decades under Mexican rule. Control of Southern California changes hands more than once during the conflict. Local resistance emerges. Military forces move through the region. The future of California remains uncertain for a time. The population of Los Angeles remains relatively small, and the settlement itself avoids the kind of large-scale destruction seen elsewhere in the world. Still, the war marks a turning point. When the conflict ends in 1848 with the signing of the treaty that concludes the war, California officially becomes part of the United States. For the third time in less than 70 years, Los Angeles finds itself under a new national government. First Spain, then Mexico, now the United States. The land remains the same. The plaza still sits at the center of the settlement. Yet politically, a new chapter has begun. At almost the exact same moment, another event transforms California's future. Gold is discovered in Northern California. News of the discovery spreads rapidly. What follows becomes known as the Gold Rush, one of the largest migration events in American history. Within months, people begin arriving from around the world. Ships fill the harbors along the Pacific coast. Wagon trains cross deserts and mountains. Thousands of fortune seekers travel toward California hoping to find wealth. Most of them are headed north toward the gold fields. But Los Angeles feels the effects as well. The population begins to increase. Businesses appear to serve travelers moving through the region. What had once been an isolated frontier settlement is becoming more connected to larger economic networks. Los Angeles is not transformed overnight into a major city. In fact, visitors during this period often describe it as a dusty town with adobe buildings, wandering livestock, and roads that become muddy after rain. The settlement remains far removed from the image of modern Los Angeles. Yet the direction of change is becoming clear. American settlers begin arriving in greater numbers. New legal systems are introduced. English becomes increasingly common alongside Spanish. Property ownership becomes more formalized as surveys and documentation replace older systems that had often relied on natural landmarks and local understanding. The rules governing land ownership shift. Economic opportunities change. Communities that had existed under Spanish and Mexican systems must now adapt to American institutions. Some families prosper during this transition. Others struggle to maintain land holdings as taxes, legal disputes, and changing regulations reshape the region. Meanwhile, transportation remains challenging. Roads are often little more than dirt trails. Rivers can become obstacles after storms. Long-distance communication remains slow. Yet compared to previous generations, movement is increasing. Stagecoaches begin operating more regularly. Merchants travel more frequently. Trade goods arrive from distant places with greater consistency. The world feels a little smaller than it once did. And Los Angeles, though still modest in size, is becoming part of that larger world. Adobe structures still dominate the landscape. Many streets remain unpaved. Horse-drawn transportation is everywhere. The pace of life remains far slower than in major eastern cities. Yet signs of growth are appearing. New businesses open. More permanent buildings are constructed. Population slowly climbs. The town begins expanding beyond its original boundaries. At night, however, much remains unchanged. Oil lamps glow through windows. The stars remain bright overhead. Coyotes can still be heard beyond the edges of settlement. The vastness of Southern California remains far greater than the footprint of human development. It would be difficult for anyone standing in the plaza during these years to imagine what the future holds. The surrounding countryside appears endless. Fields and ranchlands stretch toward distant hills. The settlement itself remains relatively small. Yet history is quietly building momentum. California's admission to the United States in 1850 brings additional investment and migration. The state's population continues growing. Economic opportunities multiply. The region becomes increasingly attractive to newcomers seeking land, business prospects, or simply a new beginning. Los Angeles grows alongside these changes. Not dramatically, not yet, but steadily, like a small stream gradually becoming a river. The foundations of the Rancho era are beginning to shift. The old agricultural economy still exists, but new influences are arriving every year. Commerce becomes more important. Transportation improves. Connections to the rest of the country become stronger. And perhaps most importantly, Los Angeles is no longer isolated. For generations, it had existed at the edge of empires, distant from centers of power and population. Now it finds itself part of a nation that is rapidly expanding westward. The future city remains hidden beneath fields, ranches, and dirt roads. But the conditions that will eventually create that city are beginning to emerge. The connections to the wider world are strengthening, and in the decades ahead, another development will accelerate this transformation even further: the arrival of the railroad, a change that will bring people, goods, and opportunity into Southern California at a scale few residents can yet imagine. For now, though, Los Angeles remains a town between worlds, part Pueblo, part American frontier settlement, still carrying traces of Spain and Mexico, already beginning to embrace the future. As the 19th century moves toward its final decades, Los Angeles is still a relatively small town. The plaza remains the center of activity. Adobe buildings continue to stand alongside newer brick structures. Wagons roll through dusty streets, and beyond the town itself, vast stretches of ranchland still dominate the landscape. To a visitor arriving in the 1870s, Los Angeles would seem quiet, even isolated. The population is only a few thousand people. Travel to the East Coast takes weeks. News arrives slowly. Much of Southern California still feels distant from the centers of American power and commerce. Yet beneath the surface, change is approaching, and this time it will arrive on steel rails. For decades, one of the greatest challenges facing Los Angeles has been its location. The city possesses fertile land, a pleasant climate, and abundant open space. But it remains difficult to reach. Goods move slowly. People move slowly. Economic growth is limited by distance. Then the railroads arrive. In the 1870s and 1880s, major rail connections begin linking Southern California to the rest of the United States. Suddenly, Los Angeles is no longer separated from eastern markets by months of difficult travel. The effect is dramatic. Travel that once required exhausting journeys by wagon or ship becomes faster, cheaper, and more predictable. People who have never seen California begin reading advertisements that describe endless sunshine, fertile farmland, and opportunities for a better life. And many decide to come. The railroad companies actively encourage migration. Brochures and newspaper advertisements paint Southern California as a near-perfect place to settle. Images show orange groves, blooming gardens, and clear blue skies. Harsh winters back east make these descriptions especially appealing. The advertisements are not entirely inaccurate. The climate truly is unusual. While much of the country experiences long periods of snow and freezing temperatures, Los Angeles enjoys mild winters and abundant sunshine. For many newcomers, the weather alone feels almost magical. And so a wave of migration begins. Families arrive seeking farmland. Entrepreneurs arrive seeking opportunity. Investors arrive hoping to profit from rising land values. The population starts growing faster than ever before. Entire neighborhoods begin appearing where open fields once existed. Land that had been used for grazing cattle is subdivided and sold. Roads extend outward from the historic center. The city is beginning to expand. At the same time, another industry emerges as a defining symbol of Southern California. Citrus. Orange trees thrive in the region's climate. Groves spread across the basin and surrounding valleys, creating landscapes unlike anything most Americans have ever seen. In spring, the blossoms fill the air with fragrance. Rows of neatly planted trees stretch across the countryside. Irrigation systems help transform dry land into productive agricultural fields. Soon, oranges become one of Southern California's most famous exports. Railroads make this possible. Fresh fruit can now be transported across the country before spoiling. A product grown beneath California sunshine can appear on dinner tables thousands of miles away. The citrus industry becomes both an economic engine and a marketing tool. Images of orange groves appear in advertisements across America. They help create an identity for Los Angeles as a place of health, abundance, and possibility. Many newcomers arrive expecting paradise. Some discover challenges they had not anticipated. Droughts still occur. Water remains a constant concern. Economic booms are often followed by periods of decline. Yet the overall trend is unmistakable. Los Angeles is growing. The famous land boom of the 1880s accelerates this transformation. Speculators buy property, hoping prices will rise. New developments appear almost overnight. Real estate advertisements promise bright futures and endless prosperity. In some areas, land values increase at astonishing rates. The excitement becomes contagious. People talk about opportunity, about growth, about what the city might someday become. And for the first time, Los Angeles begins imagining itself as something larger than a frontier town. New buildings appear. Schools expand. Businesses multiply. Hotels accommodate arriving travelers. The population becomes more diverse as people arrive from different regions and backgrounds. English increasingly dominates public life, though Spanish influences remain woven throughout the city's identity. Street names, place names, and cultural traditions continue to reflect earlier eras. The past is not disappearing. It is simply being layered beneath new developments. By the late 19th century, Los Angeles is becoming a city of contrasts. Historic adobe structures stand near newer Victorian buildings. Horse-drawn wagons share streets with emerging technologies. Agricultural fields sit beside expanding residential neighborhoods. The old pueblo and the modern city coexist in the same space. Yet despite all this growth, much of the surrounding basin remains remarkably open. If you were to climb a nearby hill and look across the landscape, you would still see large stretches of farmland, orchards, and undeveloped land. The city occupies only a small fraction of the basin that surrounds it. No one yet imagines freeways. No one imagines movie studios. No one imagines millions of residents spread across hundreds of square miles. Those developments belong to another century. For now, Los Angeles is experiencing its first great transformation. The railroad has connected it to the nation. The The citrus industry has given it a recognizable identity. Migration has accelerated growth, and the idea of Los Angeles as a place of opportunity is beginning to take root. As evening settles over the city, trains continue arriving from distant places. New residents step onto station platforms carrying luggage, hopes, and plans for the future. Some will stay. Some will leave. But collectively, they are helping shape a city that is growing faster with each passing year. The quiet pueblo founded near a river a century earlier is becoming something new. Not yet a metropolis. Not yet a global city. But no longer a remote settlement at the edge of the map. The foundations of modern Los Angeles are beginning to emerge. And in the decades ahead, even greater changes will arrive. Changes driven not by railroads or orange groves, but by water, engineering, and the relentless ambition of a city determined to keep growing. As the 19th century gives way to the 20th, Los Angeles finds itself facing a problem that seems almost impossible to solve. The city is growing. People continue arriving from across the United States. New neighborhoods are appearing. Businesses are expanding. Citrus groves stretch across the landscape, and developers envision a future far larger than the city has ever known. But there is one challenge that overshadows all the others. Water. The Los Angeles basin has many advantages. It enjoys abundant sunshine, fertile soil in certain areas, and a climate that attracts newcomers year-round. Yet it has never possessed an unlimited water supply. The Los Angeles River, which had sustained the pueblo since its founding, remains an unreliable source. Some years bring healthy flows. Other years bring drought. The river alone cannot support the population growth that city leaders imagine. And so, as Los Angeles enters the early 1900s, a question begins to dominate discussions among planners and engineers. How can a city continue growing when it does not have enough water of its own? The answer will reshape the history of Los Angeles forever. At the center of this story is a man named William Mulholland, an immigrant engineer who rises through the city's water department and becomes one of the most influential figures in Los Angeles history. Mulholland and other city leaders begin studying distant water sources. Their attention eventually turns to the Owens Valley, a region located hundreds of miles northeast of Los Angeles, beyond mountain ranges and desert landscapes. The valley possesses something Los Angeles desperately needs: water. Snowmelt from the Sierra Nevada mountains flows into streams and rivers that cross the Owens Valley. To city planners, this water appears to offer a solution to Los Angeles's future. But obtaining it will require one of the most ambitious engineering projects in American history. In the early years of the 20th century, work begins on what will become the Los Angeles Aqueduct. The scale of the project is difficult to imagine. Workers must build canals, tunnels, pipelines, and other infrastructure across hundreds of miles of rugged terrain. Mountains must be crossed. Deserts must be traversed. Remote construction camps spring up in isolated locations where laborers work under challenging conditions. For years, thousands of workers devote themselves to the effort. They blast through rock. They dig channels through difficult ground. They construct enormous systems designed to move water using gravity alone. Day after day, month after month, the project advances across the landscape. Meanwhile, Los Angeles watches and waits. The city continues growing even before the aqueduct is completed. Streetcars carry residents through expanding neighborhoods. New homes appear on former farmland. Businesses invest in the belief that greater resources will soon arrive. There is a sense that Los Angeles stands on the edge of something larger. Then, in 1913, the aqueduct is completed. Water begins its long journey from the Owens Valley to Los Angeles. The achievement is celebrated as a triumph of engineering and ambition. For many residents, it feels as though the city has secured its future. The limits that once seemed unavoidable suddenly appear less restrictive. Water can now be imported from far away. Growth can continue. Expansion can accelerate. And accelerate it does. During the years that follow, Los Angeles grows at a remarkable pace. Neighborhoods spread outward across the basin. Developers purchase land and create new subdivisions. Roads extend farther into previously undeveloped areas. The city begins annexing surrounding communities, often encouraging them to join Los Angeles in exchange for access to the growing water system. In this way, water becomes more than a resource. It becomes a tool that shapes the physical boundaries of the city itself. Areas that gain access to water become attractive places to build homes and businesses. Areas without reliable supplies struggle to compete. The map of Los Angeles begins changing accordingly. Yet the story of the aqueduct is not entirely one of celebration. In the Owens Valley, many residents feel differently. As water is redirected southward, local communities experience significant changes. Farmers and ranchers worry about their future. Tensions rise between Los Angeles and Valley residents. Over time, disagreements become increasingly bitter. The struggle over water becomes one of the most famous and controversial chapters in California history. For the people living in Los Angeles, however, the immediate impact is unmistakable. The city now possesses the resources needed to pursue an ambitious future, and that future arrives quickly. By the 1920s, Los Angeles feels dramatically different from the town that existed only a few decades earlier. Automobiles are becoming more common. Residential neighborhoods spread across broad sections of the basin. Commercial districts expand. Construction cranes rise above developing areas. The population grows into the hundreds of thousands. The city no longer resembles a frontier settlement. It is becoming a major urban center. Yet despite all the changes, the landscape continues to influence development. The mountains still frame the horizon. The ocean still shapes the climate. The basin still provides room for outward growth. But now, thanks to imported water, those natural boundaries seem less restrictive than before. The city can reach farther, build farther, imagine farther. At sunset, workers return home through streets that did not exist a generation earlier. Children grow up in neighborhoods built on former ranchland. Orange groves still remain in many places, but houses are beginning to replace them. The transformation is gradual when viewed day by day. But over decades, it becomes extraordinary. Los Angeles is no longer simply growing. It is reinventing itself. Water has given the city confidence. Confidence that expansion can continue. Confidence that the future can be larger than the present. And as the 1920s approach, another force is preparing to reshape Los Angeles in ways no engineer could have predicted. Not water, not railroads, not agriculture, but moving pictures. A young industry that will soon turn a quiet district called Hollywood into one of the most recognizable places on Earth. And once again, Los Angeles will find itself transformed. As the 20th century begins, Los Angeles is already changing rapidly. Railroads have connected the city to the rest of the nation. New neighborhoods are spreading across the basin. The population continues to grow, and the future seems larger than ever before. Yet few people could have predicted the development that would eventually make Los Angeles famous around the world. It begins not with a grand plan, but with a new technology, motion pictures. In the earliest years of filmmaking, movies are still a novelty. They are short, silent, and often only a few minutes long. Audiences gather in small theaters to watch moving images that seem almost magical. No one yet knows that this new form of entertainment will become one of the most influential industries in modern history. And certainly no one knows that Los Angeles will become its capital. At the time, most film production takes place on the East Coast, particularly around New York and New Jersey. Studios operate there because that is where many businesses are already located. Equipment manufacturers are nearby. Investors are nearby. The industry is still young enough that no one sees a strong reason to move elsewhere. Filming requires light. And on the East Coast, weather can be unpredictable. Rain interrupts production. Clouds reduce visibility. Winter limits outdoor filming. Southern California offers something different. Sunshine. For most of the year, the skies are clear. Temperatures remain mild. Outdoor filming can continue through seasons that would halt production elsewhere. Filmmakers begin taking notice. There is another advantage as well. The landscape around Los Angeles is remarkably varied. Within a relatively short distance, a production company can find beaches, mountains, deserts, farmland, forests, and growing urban neighborhoods. A Western film can be shot in the hills. A coastal scene can be filmed by the Pacific. A desert adventure can be staged just beyond the city. For a young industry trying to keep costs low, these advantages are significant. And so, slowly at first, film companies begin heading west. One of the places they settle is a small community called Hollywood. At the time, Hollywood is not yet part of Los Angeles. It is a quiet town surrounded by agricultural land and open space. Its streets are modest. Its population is small. Its future is uncertain. But its location proves ideal for filmmaking. In the early 1900s, small studios begin appearing. Simple buildings house cameras, sets, and production crews. Many films are still silent. Actors rely on exaggerated expressions and movements to tell stories. Directors experiment constantly, inventing techniques that audiences have never seen before. The industry feels less like a polished machine and more like a collection of creative workshops. Everyone is learning as they go. Yet audiences love it. Movie theaters begin appearing across the country. More actors arrive in Los Angeles seeking opportunity. More writers, directors, and technicians follow. The industry gains momentum. Then comes another important development. Feature-length films. Instead of brief scenes lasting only minutes, filmmakers begin telling longer, more complex stories. Audiences become increasingly invested in the characters they see on screen. The popularity of movies rises dramatically. Hollywood grows alongside it. By the 1910s and 1920s, the area is transforming. New studios occupy larger parcels of land. Backlots are constructed. Entire streets are built solely for filming. Buildings designed to resemble distant cities or historical periods appear almost overnight. The contrast is remarkable. A visitor might see cowboys filming a western in one area, while another crew creates a medieval castle nearby. Hollywood becomes a place where imagination shapes the landscape as much as reality. As the industry grows, a new phenomenon emerges. Movie stars. For the first time, audiences begin following the lives and careers of performers they have never met. Actors become celebrities. Their names appear on posters. Their photographs appear in magazines. Fans across the country recognize faces from films and eagerly await new releases. Hollywood becomes more than a location. It becomes an idea, a symbol of dreams, creativity, and opportunity. People begin arriving from across America, hoping to become actors, writers, directors, or musicians. Most do not become famous, but they continue coming, drawn by the possibility that something extraordinary might happen. Meanwhile, Los Angeles itself continues expanding. Streetcars connect growing neighborhoods. Residential development spreads across former farmland. The city's population climbs into the hundreds of thousands. Hollywood officially becomes part of Los Angeles, linking its future even more closely to the city around it. Then, in the late 1920s, another revolution arrives. Sound. For decades, films have been silent, accompanied by musicians in theaters. Now audiences hear voices coming directly from the screen. The transition is dramatic. Studios invest heavily in new technology. Actors must adapt. Writers create dialogue instead of relying entirely on visual storytelling. The film industry enters a new era almost overnight. And Hollywood thrives. By the end of the 1920s, Los Angeles has become the center of a global entertainment industry. What began as a small agricultural community has transformed into the world's most influential filmmaking hub. Yet despite all this growth, traces of the old landscape remain. Beyond the studios, orange groves still bloom. The mountains still rise above the basin. The ocean still sends cool air inland during the evening. The natural setting that first attracted filmmakers continues to surround the industry they built. As night falls over Los Angeles, lights glow from studio lots where production continues late into the evening. Sets stand ready for tomorrow's filming. Writers work on new stories. Actors prepare for new roles. And audiences across the world wait for the next movie to arrive. The city is changing once again. No longer known only for railroads, ranches, or citrus groves. Now it is becoming known for stories. Stories projected onto screens. Stories shared across continents. Stories that will forever connect the name Hollywood with the city of Los Angeles. And in the decades ahead, even greater transformations await, as industry, population, and global influence continue to reshape the basin in ways its earliest settlers could never have imagined. As Hollywood rises in prominence during the early 20th century, another transformation is taking place across Los Angeles. Unlike the movie industry, this change attracts far less attention from distant audiences. There are no glamorous premieres, no movie stars, no flashing cameras. Instead, it unfolds beneath the ground. Deep below the basin that had once been covered with ranches, orange groves, and open fields lies a resource that will help reshape the city: oil. During the early decades of the 20th century, petroleum becomes one of the most important drivers of the city's growth. In fact, for a time, Los Angeles is one of the world's major oil-producing regions. The first discoveries arrive in the late 19th century, but production expands dramatically in the years that follow. Soon, drilling operations appear across Southern California. Oil derricks rise above neighborhoods, hillsides, and vacant land. To modern eyes, photographs from this era can seem almost surreal. Wooden derricks stand in dense clusters. Some appear near homes. Others stand close to schools, businesses, and city streets. In certain parts of Los Angeles, the structures become so common that they seem almost ordinary. The city is growing so quickly that urban development and industrial development often occur side by side. A person might leave their home in the morning, pass rows of oil wells, and continue on to work in a growing commercial district. The landscape is becoming increasingly complex. Agriculture remains important. Entertainment continues expanding. But industry is now claiming a larger role in the city's identity. Oil brings jobs. It attracts investment. It fuels construction. And perhaps most importantly, it provides energy for a rapidly modernizing society. The timing could hardly be better. The 20th century is an age of machines. Factories require power. Ships require fuel. Automobiles are becoming increasingly common. Demand for petroleum grows every year. Los Angeles is well positioned to meet that demand. As oil production expands, other industries begin developing alongside it. Manufacturing increases throughout the region. Warehouses appear. Processing facilities grow larger. Railroads transport raw materials and finished products. The city becomes more economically diverse than ever before. No longer dependent on a single industry, Los Angeles develops multiple engines of growth simultaneously. The result is remarkable. By the 1910s and 1920s, population growth accelerates once again. New residents arrive seeking employment. Neighborhoods spread farther across the basin. Developers continue transforming former farmland into residential communities. The city begins to feel less like a collection of separate settlements and more like a unified metropolitan area. Yet despite this growth, many parts of Los Angeles still retain a surprisingly open character. Large sections of the basin remain undeveloped. Orange groves continue producing fruit. Fields still occupy substantial areas. The modern city exists alongside reminders of an earlier landscape. At the same time, transportation is changing. For generations, movement through Los Angeles depended on horses, wagons, and railroads. Now a new technology is beginning to alter daily life. The automobile. At first, cars are relatively uncommon. They are expensive and often viewed as a novelty. But their popularity grows quickly. Southern California proves especially well suited to automobile travel. The mild climate allows year-round driving. The expanding geography of the city encourages personal transportation, and the growing oil industry helps support the broader culture of motor vehicles. Roads are improved. New routes are constructed. Gradually, Los Angeles begins adapting itself to the automobile. No one yet imagines the vast freeway system that will someday dominate the region. But the foundations are being laid. The city is spreading outward in a way that makes personal transportation increasingly important. Meanwhile, the port of Los Angeles is also growing. Located along the coast near San Pedro, the harbor becomes an increasingly important gateway for trade. Ships arrive carrying goods from around the world. Exports leave Southern California for distant markets. The connection between Los Angeles and the Pacific Ocean grows stronger with each passing year. What was once a relatively isolated settlement is becoming a major participant in international commerce. This growth attracts people from many different backgrounds. Immigrants arrive from various parts of the world. Workers move from other states seeking opportunity. Business owners establish new enterprises. Neighborhoods develop distinct identities shaped by the people who live there. Los Angeles becomes increasingly diverse, though not always without challenges. Rapid growth creates pressure. Housing must be built. Infrastructure must expand. Services must keep pace with rising population numbers. City leaders frequently struggle to keep up. Yet growth continues, almost relentlessly. The optimism of the era is powerful. Many residents believe Los Angeles is destined for greatness. The climate is attractive. The economy is expanding. New industries appear regularly. Opportunities seem abundant. For many newcomers, the city represents a fresh start, a place where the future feels wide open. As evening settles across the basin during the 1920s, the lights of the city stretch farther than they did only a generation earlier. Factories continue operating. Oil wells pump steadily. Streetcars carry passengers through growing neighborhoods. Movie studios work late into the night. And beyond it all, the mountains remain silhouetted against the darkening sky, watching over a city that is changing faster than ever before. The old pueblo near the river has become something entirely different. Not yet the Los Angeles of modern memory, but undeniably a major city, a place powered by industry, connected by trade, and energized by the belief that growth can continue indefinitely. Yet another transformation is waiting just ahead. The prosperity of the 1920s will not last forever. Economic hardship will arrive. Global conflict will follow. And through those challenges, Los Angeles will once again reinvent itself. This time not through oil fields or movie studios, but through wartime production, aircraft factories, and a role in world events far larger than anyone could have imagined during the quiet days of the old pueblo. As the 1920s draw to a close, Los Angeles appears to be a city with limitless momentum. Movie studios are thriving. Oil fields continue producing. New neighborhoods spread across the basin. The population has grown dramatically, and many residents believe the future will only bring more prosperity. Then, in 1929, the stock market crashes. Across the United States, the economy begins to unravel. Businesses close. Banks fail. Millions of Americans lose their jobs. The period that follows becomes known as the Great Depression, one of the most difficult economic crises in modern history. Los Angeles is not immune. Like cities throughout the country, it feels the effects of shrinking investment, reduced spending, and widespread unemployment. Yet the experience of the Depression in Los Angeles is somewhat different from that of older industrial cities. The city is still growing. People continue arriving, drawn by California's climate and the hope that opportunities might still exist in the West. Some find work. Many do not. But the steady flow of newcomers continues. Throughout the 1930s, the city becomes a place of both hardship and optimism. Families struggle to make ends meet. Workers search for jobs. Businesses operate cautiously. And yet, the sunshine still fills the basin most days, creating a strange contrast between economic difficulty and the beauty of the surrounding landscape. The federal government launches large public works programs to help combat unemployment. Across Los Angeles, workers are hired to build roads, parks, schools, bridges, and public buildings. Many of these projects leave a lasting mark on the city. Infrastructure improves. Civic buildings rise. Transportation networks expand. The city continues developing even during difficult times. Meanwhile, Hollywood provides a unique form of escape. As Americans face uncertainty in their daily lives, movie theaters remain popular. For a few hours, audiences can step away from economic worries and immerse themselves in stories, music, and adventure. Studios continue producing films at a remarkable pace. Actors become household names. Movie palaces fill with audiences seeking comfort and entertainment. In this way, Los Angeles helps shape the cultural experience of the Depression itself. But while the film industry remains important, another industry is quietly preparing to transform the city even more dramatically. Aviation. During the 1930s, aircraft technology advances rapidly. Small aviation companies establish operations in Southern California. The region's favorable weather makes it an ideal place for aircraft testing and manufacturing. Wide open land provides room for factories and airfields. Engineers experiment with new designs. Pilots push the limits of flight. At first, these developments seem important mainly to specialists. Few people realize how significant they will soon become. Then, in 1939, war breaks out in Europe. For a time, the United States remains outside the conflict. But events around the world continue to escalate. And in December 1941, everything changes. The United States enters World War II. Almost overnight, Los Angeles becomes a crucial part of the American war effort. Factories that once produced civilian goods begin manufacturing military equipment. Aircraft production expands dramatically. Shipyards increase output. New industrial facilities appear throughout Southern California. The demand for workers becomes enormous. Men and women arrive from across the country seeking jobs. Entire families relocate to Los Angeles. The city's population surges. The transformation happens with astonishing speed. Factory shifts operate around the clock. Assembly lines produce aircraft in unprecedented numbers. Workers fill train stations and bus depots. Neighborhoods grow rapidly to accommodate the influx of new residents. The aerospace industry becomes particularly important. Companies build bombers, fighters, transport aircraft, and countless components needed for the war. Southern California emerges as one of the most significant centers of aircraft production in the world. For many workers, daily life changes completely. A person who might have been unemployed only a few years earlier now finds themselves contributing to a massive industrial effort. The city hums with activity at all hours. Lights glow from factory windows late into the night. Trucks carry materials along busy roads. Train cars move supplies across the region. Los Angeles has become a city of production. The war also brings moments of anxiety. The Pacific Ocean, which had long been associated with trade and pleasant weather, now feels closer to the conflict. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, fears of enemy activity along the west coast spread throughout California. Blackout drills are conducted. Residents prepare for possibilities that never fully materialize. The uncertainty of wartime becomes part of everyday life. Yet despite these concerns, Los Angeles continues expanding. The war economy generates jobs and investment on a scale the city has never experienced before. By the time the conflict ends in 1945, Los Angeles is no longer simply a growing city. It has become a major industrial center. Its population is larger. Its economy is stronger. Its infrastructure is more extensive. And its connection to the aerospace industry will continue shaping the region for decades to come. The conclusion of the war brings celebration and relief. Soldiers return home. Factories begin transitioning back to civilian production. Families look toward a more peaceful future. But another transformation is already beginning. Millions of Americans are preparing to start new lives. They want homes. They want cars. They want space. And Southern California seems perfectly positioned to provide all three. The years after World War II will bring one of the greatest periods of growth in Los Angeles history. Neighborhoods will spread farther than ever before. Automobiles will reshape daily life. And a vast network of freeways will begin stitching together a city that is rapidly expanding in every direction. The quiet pueblo near the river now feels unimaginably distant. Los Angeles has become a major American city, and its biggest growth is still ahead. The war had ended, and the city seemed to exhale. Los Angeles, in the years after World War II, did not suddenly transform so much as it unfurled, like something long compressed, finally allowed to stretch outward in every direction at once. The pressure that had built during wartime production, migration, and industry did not disappear. It simply changed shape. Factories that once built aircraft and ships slowed or shifted their purpose. Streets that had been crowded with workers and uniforms began to feel different in the early morning light. But the momentum of growth remained. It had nowhere to go but outward. And outward was where Los Angeles had always been heading. The most defining change of this era was not a single building or invention, but a system, a network of roads that would come to reshape how people understood distance itself. The freeway. On paper, it was efficiency, a way to connect a sprawling region that had outgrown rail lines and streetcars, a promise of speed, of movement without interruption. On maps, the lines looked clean and logical, threading through the basin like veins drawn with intention. But on the ground, the transformation was slower, heavier. Entire neighborhoods were cut through or redirected. Familiar streets ended suddenly in construction zones. Homes stood near widening corridors of concrete and steel, as if the land itself was being reorganized while people still lived inside it. The freeway system did not arrive all at once. It accumulated, section by section, decade by decade. Ramps appeared where there had been sidewalks. Overpasses rose like quiet monuments to motion. The city began to learn a new language of exits and merges, of distances measured not in miles alone, but in minutes driven. And with that came a different way of living. The automobile, once a symbol of novelty and freedom, became something closer to necessity. It was no longer optional in the same way. The city had spread too far for anything else to comfortably hold it together. Workplaces, homes, stores, schools, all began to assume movement between them as a given condition of daily life. Where earlier Los Angeles had been shaped by rail lines and centralized clusters, this new version expanded into a more scattered form. Suburbs stretched into the San Fernando Valley, into Orange County, into lands that had once been quiet agricultural edges of the basin. Housing developments rose in repeating patterns, streets looping and curving in ways that suggested calm order, even as they extended farther from any single center. Life in these neighborhoods often felt separate, but connected through the same invisible infrastructure. Morning commutes became part of daily rhythm. Radios filled the time inside cars, soft voices and music accompanying long stretches of freeway driving. The city was no longer something you simply arrived at. It was something you moved through. Shopping centers replaced older downtown commercial streets in many areas, gathering commerce into enclosed, accessible spaces surrounded by parking lots. The experience of walking from store to store gave way, in many places, to driving between them. Even the idea of proximity began to shift. What felt close was no longer strictly physical distance, but travel time along familiar routes. And yet, beneath all of this expansion, there was still continuity. The same basin remained. The same mountains framed the horizon. The same Pacific Ocean sat to the west, unchanged in its scale and rhythm, as if observing the city's outward growth without participating in it. Infrastructure projects continued to shape the region in subtle but lasting ways. Water systems expanded alongside roads. Power grids extended further into new developments. Everything required coordination across larger and larger spaces. The city was not just growing, it was being assembled in layers of utility and access. For many, this era represented opportunity. Home ownership became more widely attainable in the expanding suburbs. Families could settle into newly built communities that promised space, stability, and a certain quiet separation from the density of older urban cores. Lawns, driveways, and cul-de-sacs became familiar features of this new landscape. But the expansion also carried complexity beneath its surface. Some communities were displaced or divided by freeway construction. Older neighborhoods were altered in ways that could not easily be reversed. The geometry of the city changed, and with it, patterns of connection and separation that would continue to shape daily life for decades to come. Still, from a distance, it could appear almost orderly. A city learning to spread itself across a vast basin, adapting to the dominance of the automobile, building systems to support a way of life defined by motion. By the end of this period, Los Angeles was no longer a collection of nearby towns loosely connected. It had become something larger and more diffuse. A metropolitan region without a single clear center, held together by freeways, infrastructure, and shared geography rather than compactness. And as the sun set over long stretches of concrete roads, headlights beginning to trace slow streams of light across the basin, the city continued to move, quietly, steadily, outward, without ever fully stopping to define where its edges might be. By the time Los Angeles had been reshaped by freeways and suburban expansion, another version of the city had already been growing in parallel, less visible in concrete and infrastructure, but far more influential in imagination. Hollywood, by the early and mid-20th century, had become something unusual. Not just a place, and not just an industry, but a kind of machine for producing images of life itself. A system that translated motion, light, and performance into stories that could travel far beyond the basin. It had begun earlier, in the quiet years when filmmakers moved west to escape restrictions, drawn by open land, steady sunlight, and distance from the industrial centers of the East. But by the time of the studio era, Hollywood was no longer a fringe experiment. It was structured, organized, and expanding into its own internal geography of sound stages, backlots, office buildings, and controlled environments designed to simulate almost anywhere in the world. Within these spaces, entire cities could be built and dismantled in days. Streets existed only as long as a scene required them. Interiors were constructed without concern for permanence. Everything was temporary, and yet everything felt strangely real when captured on film. This was part of the quiet paradox of Hollywood. It created places that did not need to endure physically in order to endure culturally. During the so-called Golden Age of cinema, roughly the 1920s through the 1950s, the studio system reached its height. Large production companies controlled nearly every aspect of filmmaking: actors under contract, writers shaping narratives, directors working within carefully managed schedules. It was an assembly line of stories, but the product was emotion, fantasy, and reflection. Silent films gave way to sound, and suddenly the city itself seemed to gain a voice. Dialogue, music, and ambient sound transformed the experience of cinema. The transition was not entirely smooth. Some careers faded as new technologies arrived, while others emerged almost overnight. But the momentum of storytelling only increased. Los Angeles, in this period, began to exist in two overlapping realities. One was physical, the expanding basin of roads, suburbs, industry, and ports. The other was projected, on screens across the country and eventually across the world. Films carried images of California light, palm-lined streets, ocean horizons, and endless sunshine. Even when stories were set elsewhere, they often carried the visual imprint of the region. In this way, Los Angeles was exporting not just entertainment, but atmosphere. The city began to be known globally in a way that was not entirely tied to its physical reality. People who had never visited could still recognize its moods, its silhouettes, its imagined lifestyles. It became a symbol layered over the actual place. Inside the studios, craftsmanship evolved quickly. Cinematography refined how light shaped emotion. Editing created rhythm and pacing that influenced how audiences experienced time itself. Music scores guided feeling in subtle, almost unconscious ways. The entire process became a language, spoken through image and sound rather than words alone. And like the freeway system reshaping physical movement across the basin, Hollywood reshaped emotional and cultural movement across distance. Fame itself began to take on new dimensions. Actors were no longer just performers on a stage or in a single theater. They became recurring presences, appearing in multiple films, inhabiting roles that accumulated into public identity. The idea of the movie star became something distinct, someone both known and unknown, familiar yet distant, present in image more than in person. Los Angeles absorbed this identity slowly but deeply. Neighborhoods near the studios carried the quiet hum of production, trailers arriving early in the morning, sets being constructed behind walls, extras moving through scenes that would later be seen by millions. Yet much of it remained invisible to everyday life in the wider city. As television emerged later in the mid-20th century, this cultural influence expanded again. The screen moved into homes, shrinking the distance between production and audience. Los Angeles became not just a place where stories were made, but a place where the structure of everyday storytelling itself was being redesigned. Through all of this, the physical city continued its parallel expansion. Freeways stretched outward. Suburbs grew. Industry shifted and adapted. But Hollywood's influence operated on a different scale, less about geography, more about perception. It created an image of Los Angeles that often felt brighter, smoother, and more continuous than the fragmented reality of its neighborhoods and infrastructure. At times, the city seen on screen felt like an idealized version of itself, carefully framed and edited, with edges softened and contradictions held just out of view. And yet, both versions were real in their own ways. The physical basin and the cinematic projection coexisted, each shaping how the other was understood. By the end of this era, Los Angeles had become something larger than a single industry or system. It was a place where physical expansion and cultural projection moved in tandem, one building roads and suburbs, the other building stories and symbols that traveled even farther. And as studio lights dimmed at the end of long production days and sound stages emptied into quiet backlots, the city outside continued to glow, half real, half imagined, and steadily broadcasting itself to the rest of the world. By the late 20th century, Los Angeles was no longer a city defined by a single direction of growth. It had already spread outward across its basin, stitched together by freeways, suburbs, and layers of infrastructure. But now, another transformation was unfolding, one that was less about land and more about people. If earlier chapters of the city's story were written in roads, railways, and studio lights, this chapter is written in languages, food, music, and migration. Los Angeles became one of the most diverse urban regions in the world not through a single event, but through decades of steady arrival. People came from across the United States and from across the globe, Latin America, East and Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, each wave adding another layer to an already complex city. And unlike earlier eras of expansion, this change did not spread evenly outward. It concentrated, overlapped, and interwove. Neighborhoods became mosaics of identity, each one shaped by overlapping histories and ongoing movement. In some parts of the city, Spanish became the dominant everyday language again, but in a form that reflected new origins and experiences. Mexican, Salvadoran, Guatemalan, and many others. Markets, bakeries, and small shops formed quiet anchors of daily life, where the rhythm of the city could be measured in conversations at counters and the repetition of familiar transactions. In other neighborhoods, Korean signage filled entire commercial corridors, where strip malls became dense centers of language, commerce, and social life. In areas shaped by Armenian, Persian, Chinese, Filipino, Vietnamese, and countless other communities, the same pattern appeared again and again, the adaptation of space into something both new and continuous with older traditions. Rather than replacing what existed before, these communities often layered themselves over it. A single street might contain traces of multiple eras, an old storefront from a previous economic cycle, a new restaurant in a different language, housing that has shifted hands across generations. The city began to feel less like a single unified plan and more like a living archive of movement. Immigration in Los Angeles was not a distant phenomenon. It was embedded in daily life. It shaped what people ate, what languages were heard on sidewalks, what music drifted from open windows, what festivals appeared in public parks and streets. It shaped the rhythm of work, school, and family life in ways that were both visible and subtle. And over time, this diversity became not an exception, but the defining condition of the city. At the same time, economic cycles continued to reshape neighborhoods internally. Some areas experienced waves of investment and renewal, while others faced disinvestment and transition. Housing patterns shifted, sometimes rapidly. Rent changes, redevelopment projects, and changing industries influenced where people could live and how long they could stay. But even through these pressures, communities rarely disappeared entirely. They shifted, adapted, and reformed in new configurations across the basin. A neighborhood might change its dominant language, its primary businesses, or its cultural center of gravity, but it rarely became empty of identity. Instead, identity itself became layered. Schools reflected this complexity. Classrooms brought together children from many linguistic and cultural backgrounds, often creating environments where multiple histories existed side by side in everyday interaction. The city, in a sense, was constantly teaching itself how to be multilingual, not just in speech, but in social understanding. Food became one of the most visible expressions of this transformation. Restaurants and home kitchens carried recipes across borders, adapting them to new ingredients, new neighborhoods, and new audiences. Over time, cuisines that had once been geographically distinct began to exist next to each other on the same streets, sometimes even blending in subtle ways. And beneath all of this, the physical city remained familiar in structure. The freeways still carried traffic across long distances. The basin still held the same mountains and ocean edges. The climate still shifted in its quiet seasonal rhythm. But the meaning of the city, what it felt like to live inside it, had changed significantly. Los Angeles was no longer easily described as a single cultural identity. It was many identities, overlapping in the same space, sometimes harmonizing, sometimes existing in parallel, sometimes quietly colliding and reshaping each other over time. Even civic life reflected this complexity. Politics, public services, and community organizations operated within a landscape that required constant negotiation between different needs, histories, and perspectives. The city was too large, too varied, too distributed to ever fully simplify itself again. And yet, from a distance, it still appeared as one place. A single name on a map. A single cluster of light at night when seen from above. That contrast, between unity in name and multiplicity in reality, became one of the defining features of modern Los Angeles. As decades passed, newer generations grew up in a city that had always already been this way. For them, diversity was not an arrival. It was the baseline, the starting condition, the air they moved through without needing explanation. And so the city continued, not as a finished structure, but as an ongoing accumulation of lives, languages, and neighborhoods, each one adding to the quiet complexity of everything else already there. By the late 20th century and into the early 21st, Los Angeles had already become something vast enough that no single moment could fully define it. It was a city built in layers, of roads, neighborhoods, industries, migrations, and images. But beneath that accumulation, there were periods when tension rose to the surface, when the systems holding everything together were tested in visible and sometimes painful ways. One of the most widely remembered of these moments came in 1992, following the acquittal of police officers involved in the beating of Rodney King. What began as a verdict in a courtroom quickly expanded into a larger expression of frustration, anger, and long-standing inequality. The unrest that followed was not isolated to a single cause or location. It reflected deeper divisions that had been present in the city for decades. In certain neighborhoods, the aftermath was immediate and visible. Buildings damaged, storefronts burned, streets that had once carried routine traffic now marked by disruption. But even in the midst of this upheaval, the city did not stop. It continued to function in partial ways, unevenly, as different areas experienced different realities at the same time. What followed in the years after was not a simple resolution, but a gradual process of rebuilding and reflection. Community organizations grew more active in some areas. Conversations about policing, economic inequality, and neighborhood investment became more central to civic life. Los Angeles, as it often had before, did not resolve into a single direction. Instead, it continued to adjust unevenly across its vast geography. At the same time, the city faced another long-running challenge that was less dramatic in a single moment but more persistent in its presence: environmental strain. For much of the 20th century, Los Angeles had been associated with a visible haze that often settled over the basin. Smog, produced by a combination of vehicle emissions, industrial activity, and the unique geography of the region, became one of the city's defining atmospheric conditions. Surrounded by mountains that could trap air within the basin, Los Angeles often held onto what it produced, cycling it slowly through layers of stillness. Over time, regulatory changes, technological improvements, and shifting awareness led to gradual reductions in air pollution. But the memory of those dense, hazy skies remained part of the city's identity. Even improvements carried a sense of long effort rather than sudden change. Earthquakes, too, remained an underlying presence in the experience of living in Southern California. Most were small, barely noticed except for a passing shift in sensation or a brief moment of alertness. But larger events occasionally reminded residents that the ground beneath the city was not fixed in the way it appeared. It was part of a moving system, slow and continuous, even if imperceptible most of the time. These environmental realities shaped how the city thought about itself, not as a permanent structure, but as something always subject to adjustment. In the same period, economic change continued to reshape the urban landscape. Some industries expanded, particularly entertainment, technology, logistics, and international trade through the ports. Others declined or moved away. This created uneven patterns of opportunity and pressure across different neighborhoods. Downtown Los Angeles, for example, experienced cycles of decline and renewal. Office buildings and older districts that had once been central to business activity went through periods of lower occupancy, followed by waves of redevelopment and reinvestment. Residential life slowly returned to areas that had previously been dominated by commercial use, changing the rhythm of streets that had once emptied after working hours. Across the wider basin, housing pressures grew more visible. As populations continued to increase and demand remained high, affordability became a central concern for many residents. Neighborhood stability, once taken for granted in some areas, became more variable. People moved more frequently, sometimes within the same region, sometimes across it entirely, following shifts in work, rent, and opportunity. And yet, despite these pressures, Los Angeles never stopped expanding in meaning as well as size. New forms of culture, business, and community continued to emerge. Art scenes evolved in different districts. Music movements developed in local spaces before spreading outward. Small businesses adapted to changing demographics and technologies. The city was not static under pressure. It was responsive, even when that response was uneven or incomplete. Transportation remained central to this experience. Freeways still carried the daily flow of movement across vast distances, but congestion became a familiar part of life. Commutes lengthened in many areas, and time spent in transit became a shared experience across wide segments of the population. The act of moving through the city often felt like moving through layers of time, older infrastructure, newer developments, and everything in between. Technology gradually added another layer. Communication began to shift through digital networks, changing how people coordinated work, maintained relationships, and accessed information. This did not replace the physical structure of the city, but it altered how that structure was experienced. Distance remained, but it was now accompanied by constant connection. Through all of this, social tension, environmental challenge, economic change, and technological transition, Los Angeles continued its familiar pattern of reinvention, not in sudden transformations, but in continuous adjustments that accumulated over time. The city did not move toward a final form. Instead, it remained in a state of ongoing response, shaped by what it had been and what it was becoming at the same time. And as evening returned again across the basin, with lights stretching across freeways and neighborhoods in long, quiet patterns, Los Angeles remained what it had always been in modern form, a place constantly negotiating itself, never fully settled, always still in motion even when it appeared still from a distance. Los Angeles today exists as something both familiar and difficult to fully define in a single image. It is still a city of geography, of basin and mountains, ocean and desert edges, but it is also something larger than its physical outline suggests. A metropolitan region that stretches across countless neighborhoods, each with its own rhythm, its own center of gravity, its own sense of daily life. There is no single downtown that contains it all. Instead, there are many centers, many versions of downtown, depending on where you are standing. Some are shaped by commerce and finance, others by entertainment, others by community history, culture, or trade. The city resists compression. It spreads outward in meaning as much as in distance. From above, at night, Los Angeles appears as a vast field of light. Freeways trace continuous lines between glowing clusters. Neighborhoods form constellations rather than a single nucleus. Movement is always present. Cars on long commutes, delivery routes crossing regions, flights arriving and departing through the basin's edges. Even in stillness, there is motion embedded in the structure. Technology now runs quietly alongside this physical geography. Work, communication, entertainment, and commerce flow through digital systems that overlay the city without replacing it. People may live in one part of the basin, work remotely for another, and maintain social or cultural ties that extend far beyond either. Distance still exists, but it is layered with connection that does not require physical proximity in the same way it once did. And yet, despite this digital expansion, the physical realities of the city remain central. The freeways still carry the weight of daily movement. The ocean still defines the western edge, steady and unchanged. The mountains still hold the horizon in place, framing the basin in a way that cannot be altered by infrastructure or technology. The climate continues its quiet rhythm, dry, then occasionally wet, always shaping the texture of the landscape. Light behaves in a way that has long defined the region. Clear mornings, bright midday glare, and long, soft evenings that stretch across streets and rooftops. These natural conditions remain one of the most consistent elements of the city's identity, even as everything built within them continues to evolve. Economically, Los Angeles today is layered across many industries at once. Entertainment remains globally influential, continuing to produce images and stories that circulate worldwide. Trade through the ports connects the region to international supply chains. Technology sectors expand in parallel with older industries, while smaller local economies continue to operate in neighborhoods across the basin. No single industry defines the whole, but many together sustain it. Migration continues as well, as it has for much of the city's modern history. People arrive from other parts of the United States and from across the world, bringing languages, skills, and cultural traditions that become part of the existing landscape. At the same time, long-established communities continue to evolve in place. The result is not a finished pattern, but an ongoing process of layering and adjustment. Housing remains one of the most visible pressures shaping daily life. Different neighborhoods experience this in different ways, but the overall effect is a constant negotiation between space, cost, and access. Some areas change rapidly, others slowly, but few remain entirely unchanged over long periods of time. Still, within this movement, there are patterns of continuity. People return to familiar places. Streets maintain their character even as businesses change. Certain corners, parks, and stretches of road carry memory across generations. The city does not erase itself as it transforms, it accumulates. Environmental awareness is now more integrated into how the city understands itself. Water usage, wildfire risk in surrounding regions, air quality, and climate variability are part of everyday conversation and planning. These concerns are not abstract. They are tied directly to the geography of the basin and the surrounding landscapes that shape it. And earthquakes remain, as they always have, a reminder that the ground itself is part of a longer system of movement. Most are small, unnoticed, absorbed into routine. But their presence reinforces a quiet understanding that stability here is always relative, always part of a larger balance. Los Angeles today is also deeply connected outward. It is not only a place of arrival, but also a place that sends out culture, labor, technology, and stories. What is created here does not remain here. It moves through networks of media, trade, and communication, becoming part of a global circulation that reflects back on the city in return. And so the city exists in a kind of loop, producing images of itself, receiving interpretations of those images, adjusting, and continuing forward. If there is a defining characteristic of Los Angeles in the present moment, it may be this ongoing state of motion without a final form. A city that has never fully resolved into a single identity, because it is always absorbing new layers of people, systems, and meaning. Even the idea of now feels temporary here, as if it is already becoming something slightly different just beyond the edge of perception. And as day shifts into night once again across the basin, the city settles into its familiar pattern of light and movement. Freeways glowing, neighborhoods quietly active, distant hills holding their shape, continuing forward without conclusion, still unfolding, still becoming. And so, after all its layers, its beginnings in coastal valleys, its centuries of shifting governance, its expansion through railroads and freeways, its images on screens, its migrations, its reinventions, Los Angeles remains something that never quite settles into completion. It is a city that has learned to exist in motion, not only movement across space, but movement through time itself. Old neighborhoods still sit beneath newer ones in subtle ways, their histories not erased so much as absorbed. Streets that once carried horses now carry endless streams of cars. Quiet ranch land became suburbs. Suburbs became part of a larger, continuous metropolitan field that no longer has a clear edge. And yet, beneath all of that change, the same geography remains. The basin still holds the city the way it always has, wide and open, shaped by surrounding mountains that stand like slow guardians at its edges. The ocean still arrives each day in steady rhythm, cooling the western air, reminding everything nearby that the world extends far beyond the glow of streetlights and highways. At night, Los Angeles does not become still. It becomes legible in a different way. Freeways trace long, glowing lines across the dark. Neighborhoods soften into clusters of light, each one carrying its own small constellation of lives moving quietly through evening routines. Somewhere, a studio lot continues filming. Somewhere else, a kitchen light stays on late. Planes move across the sky at intervals, so steady they begin to feel like part of the background of thought itself. The city does not pause. It simply changes its texture. Even now, it remains shaped by everything that came before it, by indigenous villages that understood the land through cycles, by Spanish and Mexican settlements that adapted to distance and scarcity, by ranchos stretched across open space, by railroads that tightened connection, by water systems that extended possibility, by freeways that redefined movement, by studios that projected images outward, by generations of people who arrived and stayed and changed it again. All of those layers still exist here, not as separate chapters, but as overlapping presents. Los Angeles is not a story that has concluded. It is a place where earlier versions of itself continue to echo quietly beneath newer ones, where history is not behind the present, but under it, and sometimes beside it, and sometimes indistinguishable from it. And perhaps that is what it has always been, more than anything else. A city that never stops becoming itself, even when it seems still. The lights continue to glow across the basin. The air cools slightly as the night deepens. The ocean keeps its steady rhythm just beyond the edge of the city's reach. And everything, for a moment, holds in a kind of quiet suspension, neither beginning nor ending, just continuing.